Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatore. Now this is a fairly simple video, and for anyone who follows our Facebook page, well, firstly for anyone who doesn't follow our Facebook page, why don't you follow our Facebook page, link below. But for anybody who follows our Facebook page, you will have seen me post about this already. And this is about the weight of medieval swords, but specifically about the fact that when I was coming into HEMA nearly 20 years ago now, one of the main things that we were really kind of adamant about changing the world is the impression of the weight of medieval swords. And some people in some parts of the world seem to be under the impression that medieval broadswords were incredibly heavy. And this is a pervasive myth, probably from the Victorian period, but just generally from media, shall we say, mass media in the 20th century as well, including things like role-playing games and TV, movies and everything like that. But we kind of, in my opinion, we swung a little bit too far in the other direction. So medieval swords aren't hugely heavy. So generally speaking, for something like a one-handed medieval sword, we're looking at something in the region of something like 2.5 pounds, and for a long sword we're looking at something like 3.5 pounds, this kind of weight. I'll talk in grams in a minute when I'm getting into some specifics. I understand, incidentally, obviously the American viewers probably know pounds better, and certainly the Brits do, but grams I think are the superior the kind of method of measuring the mass of swords, because it's a bit more precise, okay, and I think there's a general movement towards grams. But generally speaking, there was a swing in the other direction to basically accentuate how light and nimble medieval swords were. Well, let's not go too far. Within the grand scheme of things, actually, medieval swords are a little bit on the heavy side. And that's actually where the myth, the urban myth actually comes from. If they were lighter than, on average, if they were lighter than Victorian period swords or Napoleonic period swords, or if they were lighter than Indian swords or whatever, then this myth never would have come about, probably. The fact is that they are slightly on the heavy side, globally compared to all the other swords that have ever existed in history all over the world. Medieval swords are somewhat weighty. And in fact, some of the heaviest swords recorded ever as being used are Renaissance two-handed, what we would call two-handed swords, or Zweihanders, or Spadone Montante, whatever. Those are some of the biggest and heaviest swords around. That's not the only examples. There are some very large and heavy swords, in fact, from China and Japan and Korea and other areas of the world as well, India as well. But we have to accept that medieval swords are not generally light. Now, as an illustration of that, I posted on the Facebook page, and I'll post the link below here as well, to Hermann Historica, are an auctioneer specialised in arms and armour, based in Germany. And I posted a link to a previous sword that was sold by them some years ago now, which is one of the famous Castillon, or Castellon, it's spelt Castillon, or River Dordogne hoard of swords. Now, what these are, for anyone who doesn't know, is that in the 1970s, what seems to be the French Navy, probably, or at least some official government body, were dredging the River Dordogne for some reason, and they came across some casks, let's say barrels, full of medieval swords. And these became, because of the proximity, these became associated with the Battle of Castillon. And Ewart Oakeshott and other people championed the idea that there were maybe booty coming back from the Battle of Castillon, which happened in 1453. It was the end. It was kind of one of the last big battles of the 100 Years' War between England and France, and officially the 100 Years' War ended the year after in 1454, essentially with the fall of Bordeaux. But the Battle of Castillon in 1453 was pivotal towards the end of the 100 Years' War. And so the idea was, because you've got these barrels of swords which come in two main types with some other types, a smattering of other types mixed in, but with two main types, category A, or group A and group B, but I won't go into that in this video, maybe in a future one. And the idea was maybe these swords were gathered up after the battle from the corpses or from the prisoners, and they were being shipped down the River Dordogne to be sold as booty. this is one theory. Now, it's not been proven. Some people don't believe that they're associated with the Battle of Castillon and that they're actually trade goods of some kind. But anyway, whatever, a bunch of medieval swords that date to the 15th century, probably at least between they couldn't date to much between, let's say, 1425, 30-ish through to about 1460-ish. They're probably not outside that date range, so they are around the middle of the 15th century, perhaps located slightly earlier than the middle of the 15th century, or at least the centre grouping, the average, should we say, the average range being slightly before. And anyway, these swords, there's one example, Hermann Historicus sold one. There were about 80 swords, or let's say 80 to 90 swords recovered from that archaeological site, and a lot of them were sold into private collections, and so occasionally they'd come up in auction. And this particular sword was sold at Hermann Historica a few years ago, and they put the stats, very nicely, they put the stats on the catalogue listing of that sword. And you will notice that the weight of it is 1660 grams, so 1660 grams. Now, that, by no measure, is light for a one-handed sword, bearing in mind it's not just any one-handed sword, it's a one-handed sword with a simple cross hilt. I'll hold a replica sword of a roughly similar type. It's got a simple cross hilt, okay, so it doesn't have an enclosed hilt, it doesn't have the weight that some, basket hilts or saber hilts or things like this, or other types of complex hilt like rapiers and side swords have. It's got a simple cross guard and a relatively simple pommel, and it's only got a 75.4 centimetre blade, so it's not a very long sword. In fact, it's a relatively short sword in the grand scheme of things. So for not a very big sword with a simple guard, without an enclosed guard, 1660 grams is fairly weighty. And some people will go, and quite rightly so, some people will go and have gone on the Facebook page, oh, but Matt, some people think that medieval swords weigh, 6 kilograms or 10 kilograms or 20 kilograms. And yeah, this is true, but that is really massively outlandish. So it's correct that we do set the record straight and correct those people's misconceptions. Absolutely. But then what's happened is that we've swung too far in the other way, and I think lots of people now, if they see a replica sword like this and you tell them it weighs 1600 grams, they go, oh, well, I've been looking on the Albion website, or I've been, watching whatever maker's kind of Facebook page, and 1600 grams for an arming sword is really heavy. That's too heavy, man. And they would consider, and it's about 3.5 pounds, I think. They would consider that too heavy for a not very big medieval arming sword. And they're wrong, okay? The simple evidence from archaeology shows that a lot of, certainly the category A Castillon swords, are quite heavy, especially for their size, okay? Now, I'm not going to go into why that should be the case. Why were they quite big, beefy swords, quite broad, quite beefy, quite heavy swords? But just for comparison, this is an approximate replica of the so-called Henry V sword from Westminster Abbey, which is probably not Henry V's sword. It's probably one of the later king's swords, which again I'll go into in another video. But this is not a big sword, and this actually handles very nicely. It's quite nimble, and it's just lovely. It's a joy to handle. This was made by Mark Vickers of St George Armoury. Highly recommend his swords. It has a hollow pommel, as lots of swords of this period do have either completely hollow or partially hollow pommels, and it has what's called a hollow ground blade. That is, it has a bit of a midrib, and the metal is ground out, the steel is ground out from the blade, so that it's made the blade as light as possible. For the maximum breadth and length, it's reduced the weight, okay? And now this weighs 1200 grams. So bear in mind that this is a fairly beefy sword for its size, but this weighs 1200 grams. In comparison, the Albion Mercenary weighs around 1400 grams, but that's a two-handed, it's a long sword. I won't call it a two-handed sword because it's a hand and a half sword. I can use this comfortably in one hand, although it's not as nice in one hand as an actual one-handed sword, hence one-handed swords still existed. But this hand and a half type sword is generally a bit longer and a bit heavier. So we've got a sword there that's 1200 grams, we've got a sword there that's 1400 grams, but this original example from the River Dordogne in France is 1660 grams. It's a significant bit more, and a lot of the other swords from that hoard are of that weight. There is an example of a river found 15th or perhaps 14th, 15th century sword in the Wallace collection, which is a similar weight as well. It's about 3.5 pounds. So the simple fact is that sometimes medieval arming swords are kind of heavy, and when you compare that to other swords, when you compare it to tulwars, or even when you consider it to basket hilt swords, or when you compare it to sabres and things like this, it's a comparable weight with big rapiers, okay? Big rapiers are sometimes around that kind of weight, 1600 grams, although they're usually, even the biggest rapiers normally are more like 13, 14, 1500. And they're big, they're very long swords, much, much longer than this medieval arming sword we're talking about. And when we look at basket hilts, some basket hilts equally are that heavy, are a similar weight, about 1600 grams. But remember, they've got huge, great basket hilts on them, okay? And we're talking about this River Dordogne sword only has a medieval cross hilt, so it doesn't have all the weight of all the bars of the basket hilt there. So, simple fact is that yes, medieval swords didn't weigh 6 or 10 or 20 or 50 kilograms, okay? They were of course able to be used as swords, and when you've got a fairly sizable pommel and a point of balance that's near the hand, yes, a heavy sword is manageable. But let's not go too far in the other direction. Remember, when you're looking at replicas of medieval swords, actually look at the weights of the original medieval swords. Don't imagine that a medieval sword should weigh the same as a 19th century or Napoleonic sabre. They often don't. Some do, but they often don't. Some medieval swords, whether they be long swords or one-handed swords or falchions or whatever, some of them are pretty damn heavy. Okay, so don't over-egg the argument, because ultimately then you undermine the truth and the facts. Let's keep it real. Let's stick with archaeology. Let's look at the actual numbers. So there we go. To finish on that, medieval swords, yes, they weren't ludicrously heavy, but they were quite often quite heavy compared to lots of other types of sword out there. Okay, and they weren't usually super light swords. Okay, and don't think that they were. Thanks for watching, folks, and I'll see you for the next video. Cheers! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.